Hello and welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining me for this very special video. We have Bob from Elijah's Cloak, a well-known YouTube channel, doing a lot of same content as myself, plus much more. And I just want to say, first of all, big welcome. Thank you for joining us today, Bob. I believe you're treating us to a very special apparition story and how it relates for these times.
Well, thanks again for having me on. I appreciate it. And I'm honored to actually be speaking on Tre Fontane. This is a very important apparition. It happened in 1947 in Rome, where Tre Fontane is located. And I think that there's a lot of information there for the audience. And it is something that's pertinent to today. It also speaks about the coming era, the era of sanctification, as we usually call it, or the era of the divine will, the new era. And it speaks about, in great detail, the condition of the church. You can hear the voice of our Blessed Mother, very similar to our Lady of Good Success. There's some similarities to Lourdes, there's some similarities to Fatima also, and we'll touch upon these.
Excellent, I can't wait. I did do a short video on it a few months ago when I got this very short book, and as you can see, I've color coded it with really clear messages, things that stood out. And like you said, Fatima, it was clearly there. And for the other content of videos I've done so far containing prophecies, what Our Lady's preparing us for in these times as it's becoming more and more evident by the day, I have to say, Tre Fontane is kind of my new favourite discovery just now. And the apparitions, I kind of sense when I first read the book and read her messages, how she spoke to Bruno, how she gave clear messages about the church and the world. She was unapologetic for the true Catholic faith, as one of her messages came across. She was quite blunt in a way that, yes, Garabandal, she was blunt with the messages in terms of what was given publicly, but I found this one to be quite exceptional. I don't know if that's just my own take of it, but I have to say as well, as studying in Rome for 4 years as a seminarian, having the chance to go just a few miles to the shrine, which is in the picture behind you there, I never heard of Our Lady of Revelation 12 years ago or so, and it's a new regret that I wish I did, because I'm sure I'd have been there quite often during those times of study. But I absolutely love it. I know Joe McLean and his channel had a quite a favourite time with it a couple of months ago, and yeah, me too. So you're very well studied and clued up from watching quite a number of your videos in recent months, and I'm very much looking forward to what you can tell us about it. So I'm happy to hand the reins over to you and how you best want to structure it, and maybe now and again we can get some questions in as well. But I urge everyone to keep watching this because there's a lot of crucial information, some amazing points, and everything about Tre Fontane is amazing. The place, the time, the messages, everything. So without further ado, Bob, I hand it over to you.
Thanks. So, to understand Tre Fontane, everything at Tre Fontane is important. And what do I mean by that? The when it occurs, who it occurs to and with, and also where it occurs. So, I'd like to go over that first before we go into the messages. It gives you better context, and it's easier to understand the messages when you understand those aspects. So I'd like to start off, I think, with the when. So it occurred in 1947, and it actually occurred 10 years after an initial apparition that occurred to a woman at Tre Fontane. Her name was Luigina Sanapi. And it was 10 years to the day when she had that initial apparition in 1937, April 12th, which just happens to be one of the days that's between the Garabandal miracle days of the 8th and the 16th.
Mhm.
So, in, during that day of that apparition, she was told to look for someone specifically and to ask to meet with that person's brother. And the brother would be a cardinal. And the cardinal's name was Cardinal Pacelli. And this was in 1937. So she had two messages for Cardinal Pacelli. One, that you will be the future pope, which he was 2 years later. And the other message was that our Blessed Mother would reappear there 10 years later. So she's setting the groundwork. And this is, in my mind, is to give Cardinal Pacelli, who would become Pope Pius XII in 1939, to give him the confidence when she reappears that he would understand the veracity of the messages being conveyed by our Blessed Mother to the seer there, who is Bruno Cornacchiola, who appears over my shoulder. Um, the other aspect of it that I think regarding the time is the fact that in 1947 is also a preparation for what other apparitions point to as becoming the prophecies regarding the second half of the 20th century. So you have Fatima pointing to 1960 and afterwards, and also you have Our Lady of Good Success pointing to the end of the 20th century as well. And between those two, that there are very serious prophecies that are coming out of both of those apparitions. And this is another one that is preparing us for those times. And in fact, after 1947, Our Lady continues to appear to Bruno. Well, not appear, I'm sorry. He continues to have locutions from our Blessed Mother all the way to the year 2000, 1 year before his death. So she is basically providing messages all through that time. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about Bruno himself. So, unlike many other apparitions, Bruno is not a young, innocent child that you would see at Fatima or Garabandal or a young innocent like St. Bernadette. He's actually someone who is very much like St. Paul prior to his conversion, someone who is interested in persecuting the church, which he did. He actually persecuted the church by joining the communists in the Spanish Civil War, where he was a spy for the communists there. And perhaps your audience, Mark, know more about the Spanish Civil War than the US audience would, being in Europe. But the communists persecuted the church and they targeted religious. Actually, they martyred 2,000 nuns, priests, and bishops in Spain. So you're talking about someone who had great hatred towards the church. He actually had a plan to assassinate Pope Pius XII, and he possessed a knife where he carved "Death to the Pope" on his knife that he intended to use for that purpose. And I just want to give you a background because I think this is important. He's very much a rogue. He was abusive towards his children and his wife as well. He wrote, as part of the Adventists, he wrote, I would say, I was going to say homilies, but they're not homilies. He wrote speeches that were anti our Blessed Mother. So he was basically writing speeches that countered the dogmas of the church regarding our Blessed Mother. And this is the type of person that Bruno was. Now, the reason why that's important to paint that picture is where this occurred in Tre Fontane. It's Italian for the three fountains. This is where St. Paul was martyred. So it's very reminiscent of the conversion of St. Paul. It's in the same place where he was martyred. It's a repeat, and I think it's informative for us. So when our Blessed Mother appeared, he was actually writing one of those speeches that I mentioned, and he was there with his children. She appeared first to his children, and to tell you what kind of a person that he was, when his children would not respond to him because they were in an ecstasy, he actually slapped one to try to get them to respond and to obey him. Then he became part of the ecstasy too, the apparition, and he was converted on the spot. The first words to Bruno from our Blessed Mother was, "Enough! Stop persecuting the church." So he was very similar to what St. Paul experienced, except this time it's not our Lord, it's our Blessed Mother. And why is that important? So that's important for the coming time that we're about to enter, which would be a time when we can expect the warning and other divine manifestations that were prophesied by um, Garabandal and other saints. And we can expect the same thing to occur during the warning when we're going to be in front of the divinity, just like Bruno found himself in front of our Blessed Mother, like St. Paul found himself in front of our Lord. They were converted on the spot. I mean, there's no time. It didn't take him any amount of time to come around. He instantly converted. He went running to his wife. He was all ecstatic. He instantly became someone who hates the church to someone who loves the church, and he became a very holy soul. So I said a lot there. Mark, do you have anything you'd like to interject?
Yeah, just from what I remember reading about him, he was a right brute of a man. And when he went from the communists to the Seventh Day Adventists and things like that. I think probably one of the highlighted things where he was the most sincere is he says if he never got his answer when he was taking this time away, the day of the apparition, he was coming back to kill his wife and kids. He couldn't take it anymore. But I think in a way, as God will always see the root cause to all that type of life of any person. He never had it easy growing up either. He was searching in ways. He just was going about it the wrong way. And when Our Lady appeared to him, she did make it clear, "You're persecuting me, the church, enough now." Because she did promise those 10 years prior to that lady who she first appeared to there that she'd come back to make use of she'd come back to make use of a man who persecutes the church. So the fact that she could bring the good out of even Bruno was something else. But I know there's an image. I find it very difficult to find a full image on the internet just to use as one, because I know the cassock was part of that image, but maybe the image and the messages is something you might want to pick up with now before I go off too much.
So there was a reference to the cassock and the cross, and it was in regards to the priesthood also, which our Blessed Mother saw as basically going downhill somewhat regarding purity and whatnot. A very similar message to Our Lady of Good Success. And she showed a symbol, which was the cassock and the cross. Basically, she said the broken cross. And I think that was very, very powerful message. And most priests, they don't wear cassocks any longer, as well as you well know. Some do, but most do not. And she was representing that as a decline, basically. She was saying that that is part of the decline, is symbolic of the decline. So, what I'd like to do maybe is start with the messages themselves. And I'm going to need to read these because they are in a book form. So, what I like to do is go through the messages and comment upon them. And before I forget, there is one other thing about the timing. So, the timing, I'd be remiss, and though we get a lot of comments if I didn't say that. So, the when the apparitions began in 1947 in April, it was 1 month after the death of Luisa Picaretta, who died in March 1947. And the reason why that's important is I mentioned that there's also in this apparition a desire to convey information about the new era that's to come. It doesn't go explicitly into it like Garabandal, but it touches upon it. So it's complementary to Garabandal and also Medjugorje in that sense. So I'm going to start with the first message, and forgive me if I have to take my glasses off, but I may have to do that. So the first message I have is my body could not die and did not die. So it could not decay and did not decay because I am immaculate. It was in the ecstasy of divine love that I was taken to heaven by Jesus, the Word, my Son, and the angels. Thus it was taken to the throne of divine mercy. Now, the reason why that's important is that was considered by Pope Pius XII as a confirmation of the dogma of the Assumption. And although that was already being discussed, Pope Pius XII took that, and it was known that he took this message to confirm the fact that that dogma was legitimate and it should be pronounced. And it's one of those situations where private revelation does count. It does have impact, as everyone well knows who prays the rosary.
Sure.
And Mark, please feel free to jump in with anything you'd like to say here. I know you're well versed in these messages as well.
Yeah, I mean, I put a little bit of time in after reading the book and doing one video, but I haven't touched on it since. But a couple of things are coming back to me as well. April 12th, you know me when I see clear dates, like Fatima, May 13th, and the Pope being shot May 13th, October 13th, a clear one from Pope Leo to Fatima Miracle to Akita, all October 13th. April 12th seems to be coming out a little bit more, and there's one or two others I've recently noticed just by skimming things. Can't remember what they are off the top of my head, but April 12th, the one I do remember, as the first impact of that date was a couple of years ago during lockdown, and it was Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich having a vision of where there was a great consensus asked over the church and how it was splitting in two with compromises and all this stuff. And that was April 12th, 1820. Then, of course, April 12th, 2020, churches were closed. It was the lockdowns and everything. And it was Easter Sunday of all days. So I found that quite amazing that it was 200 years to the date. Um, the other little surprise I discovered, I think what I've heard on video is different to what I've just found on the website. But Pope Pius XII, as we know, as Cardinal, Bishop, and Father Pacelli, as he came through in the church. But if I just check this website for clarification, he was ordained or he was appointed, let me just get the date here, or he was ordained a bishop on the 13th of May, 1917. Now, what stood
Mhm.
out to me when I heard in a video that he was ordained on the October 13th, 1917, but that's not on this website. He was appointed bishop on May 13th, 1917, the first apparition of Our Lady at Fatima, which again, the May 13th, 1981, Pope John Paul II was shot. And we know how much the figurehead of the Pope came in with the third secret of Fatima. So I don't think it's about just a particular Pope, it's about the papacy, the Pope, the head, when it comes to these different vicars of Christ over the ages. Those dates are not a coincidence, I don't believe. And it was another apparition many years after his death. Pope Pius XII appeared in one of the Marian apparitions, but again, I forget what it was off the top of my head. But he was also known as the Fatima Pope. I don't know if it was the best title for him or for John Paul II or not, but I know he was referred to that as well as other names. But he plays a very vital role. The fact that he had 10 years' notice before this was going to happen. And of course, Bruno did meet him in the end, didn't he? And a couple other
He
things happened there.
he met the Pope quite a few times.
Yeah,
So the Pope was convinced, Pope Pius XII was convinced that Bruno was a true seer and that the apparitions were occurring. Um, Also, Pope John Paul II, before he became Pope, visited the shrine. The shrine was started in 1956 during the pontificate of Pope Pius XII. And I'm glad you mentioned that too, because I like to point out that this apparition is approved because it falls under the jurisdiction of the local bishop, which in this case is the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. And he established the shrine. We had a subsequent visit by who would become Pope John Paul II. And that is definitely verification. The other thing that occurs here that I should have mentioned in the beginning, because I did mention there's a tie into Lourdes, there's a lot of miracles that happen here. So in Lourdes, you have the miraculous spring, and you go to Lourdes, you'll see crutches, and you'll see other tributes to the fact that people have been healed there. You have the same thing here. So you have crutches, and you'll have tributes and notes from people that have been healed, their testimony. And it's not occurring from a, it goes exactly back to what I started saying about the conversion of sinners. It's not a miraculous spring. It's what our Blessed Mother calls the soil of sin. She said she would take this soil of sin and perform miracles with it. And that's exactly what happened at Tre Fontane and continues to this day. The other thing that ties back to Fatima is there's been a number of occurrences of the miracle of the sun there, the dancing of the sun. And I have one occurrence of one of my videos, and I can share that with you, Mark, if you'd like to get that.
sure. That'd be great. I know there was one miracle of the sun when the cardinal was there when they were putting the altar in place during the mass, and that was a gift from Pope John Paul II because I know we're jumping ahead in time here, but Bruno did change his life about remarkably right up until his last dying breath. But he also wrote to John Paul II and advised him about how his life was in danger, and this was a year after he was shot. It was at the Fatima shrine. um, a laicized priest, I believe, from Pope Pius X's society tried to stab him with a dagger after all this about Bruno in 1947 with his dagger. But
Hmm.
obviously it was safe. But it came back to Bruno sometime later that the Pope did receive his letter of warning him about it. And this was the Pope thanking Our Lady and Bruno by giving them the altar. Is that correct?
Mhm. Yeah, so that's remarkable. As a matter of fact, there's a message that touches upon the threat to the Pope. Then I'd like to talk about that a little bit more when we hit that message.
Mm.
So um, there's been a number of prophecies about the martyrdom of the Pope,
Yes,
and
yes.
I want to talk about that a little bit more when we hit that message because I think That's one of the things that came to me when I reviewed these messages the last couple of days, that I didn't notice before in Bruno's prophecies.
Sure. Yeah, very much. I think it's very pertinent to these days, especially. A lot of Bruno's messages and prophecies. So please take it away.
So the next message I have is, how many miracles? You're going to love this, Mark. How many miracles? How many apparitions? There is nothing that brings you back. You are always far from the essence of life. That is the truth of the Father's love. And how true that is. How many times does our Blessed Mother need to appear to us, need to cajole us, need to warn us about chastisements to get us to repent and to change our lives?
Mm,
She is our mother, and it has to be very frustrating for her and very saddening, the fact that we're giving chance after chance after chance, and it has seemingly very little effect. Maybe enough effect to save us in some cases from certain imminent chastisements, but maybe not to save us completely, but just to mitigate them. But as you see in the current condition of the church, we've suffered greatly, and this apostasy is a severe chastisement. And I think I heard you quote a saint before, Mark, about the worst chastisement is to send us bad shepherds. And we have an apostasy within the clergy as well, within the hierarchy, not just in the world in general. It is throughout the whole world, including members of the church. And indeed is a great chastisement that we're living right now. And it's one where people feel like they're in a martyrdom just watching it, especially those who love the church. And I'm sorry if I go off too far in a tangent, just
you're all
reel
good.
me back in. Here's another one. Hard times are being prepared for you. Before Russia converts and abandons atheism, a terrible grave persecution will be unleashed. Pray it can be stopped. Now, this is in 1947, so this is early. So the greatest persecution of the communists in Russia against the church actually did not occur during the time of Stalin, occurred more in the 60s, where they actually ripped down churches, they would imprison priests, they would turn churches into stables and use them as warehouses, completely sacrilegious. And that was a severe persecution. Now, also during that time, I think is very relevant to make sure that we understand the context of time that we're in. During the 60s, we also had the threat of nuclear war with the Cuban Missile Embargo. So we definitely have the threats that she's referring to here. One more after this. The time is now approaching for the end of all things. And what is meant here by the end of all things is not the end of the world, but the end of times that we talk about in the messages at Garabandal. And she also adds that one day there will be disbelief about the real presence of my son. And this is something that is repeated in other Marian apparitions. It's a this message, I'm sorry, it is mentioned specifically in Akita, where the, Akita provides us with a message or a warning that the real presence will be denied and the Eucharist will be diminished in the eyes of many. And this is align just with that perfectly. And again, this is much prior to Akita, which happened in the 70s. Another message through a divine promise. And this is another message you're going to see that relates to something we already know. Through a divine promise, Satan is freed for a period of time, and he will light the fires of protest amongst men for the sanctification of the saints. And of course, this is a reference to the promise given Pope Leo about the release of Satan in 1884, where he had the vision of Satan speaking to God and asking for more power, which was granted to him for a period of 100 years. So you'll see a lot of tie-ins to prophecies and also other Marian apparitions, as I mentioned. The entire church will suffer a terrible trial to cleanse it of the carnality that has infiltrated its ministers, particularly among the orders of poverty. There will be moral and spiritual trials for a period of time indicated in the heavenly books. Priests and the faithful will face a difficult trial in the world of the lost. Here's an important sentence coming up. They will have attacks hurled against them by whatever means is possible, false ideologies and false theology, which is something we see rampant today. You have people who are engaging in false apologetics. They're promoting theology, which is contradicting to faith and morals of the church.
Mhm.
And my litmus test for this is always if something's proposed, does is it in accordance with the magisterial teaching? Is it in accordance with scripture? Is it in accordance with tradition? So we're seeing things proposed today, and we just seen it in the synod where they were discussing the blessing of unions and also discussing the deaconesses, so to speak. And that is something I think that is contrary to our traditions and to the teachings that we've inherited and deposited of the faith. And that's not the end of it. I mean, that's some of it. There's more to it than that. And we're in a situation also, I think, that where the church is in a true schism. And we like to maybe we'd like to maybe wash that over a little bit or whitewash it and pretend that there's unity, but there's only unity in the truth, and there's only unity in the Catholic faith. So those who are attempting to interject these false theologies and false ideologies, they're actually promoting schism. And I'm glad the ideology was mentioned here too, because there's a political note to it where people are taking political stances in the matters of faith when they should not be doing that. They should be just speaking through the spectrum of the church. In other words, they should be looking what they see in the world should be through the eyes of the faith and the eyes of the church, not vice versa, which is what's happening today, where people are looking at the church through the eyes of the world. And I just seen it today in something that I read where someone was talking about the recent declaration from the the DDF, as they call it now, the doctrine of the faith, the dicastery of the doctrine of the faith, where someone referred to far right perspectives. There's no far right. There's no far right perspective. There's no leftist perspective. There's only the Catholic perspective. And this is something that our Blessed Mother's warning us about continuously. And this is probably at a time when is a this is something that is basically it's coming before it happens. In other words, it's a prophecy. It's a warning about something that is not happening yet here in Our Lady of Tre Fontane. And one of the reasons why she's blunt like this is because she's coming to us as Our Lady or the Virgin of Revelation, comma, Mother of the Church. That's how she announced herself to Bruno. And she's speaking as our mother and the mother of the church. So she is speaking very bluntly here, and she's going to have some more messages that are even more blunt.
Yeah, for sure. False ideologies, false theologies. I mean, I think the ideologies and theologies are both in the church now, whereas you'd normally think ideologies belong to the world. And of course, we're seeing crazy ideologies coming more and more to the surface. It has been for the last so many years. And it's even going anti-science for certain ideologies. I'm sure the people know what we're talking about. Um, we're definitely in the times of Akita, for sure. I mean, but when we say we're in the times of Akita, it means we're in the times of all the prophecies because they're not individualized. They're all in context of what she's preparing us for. Because this is all coming to a conclusion. The devil's 100 years are up. And as much as people see more and more despair, more and more evil, things coming more quicker as they come towards the end now, it's not that evil is increasing. I would say it's the fact that it's grace that's increasing and the devil's throwing his toys out the pram, as his time's up. And this is everything coming at once in a desperate move to get as many souls as possible. But the mother, our mother, has came time and time again, just like here in Tre Fontane, others before, others after, still with us in Medjugorje and elsewhere, and we're chosen our side. We've been given the grace to be made aware of this, to be attracted to this, to have a compelling nature that we want to spread it to others, and that's why we're doing these videos as one way to help her. Um, but when I see a lot of things happening now in the world, I think sometimes we speak all the prophecies and videos. I think I want to start looking at like, well, let's see how that's actually rolling out in the world just now. And we can see it all over with the warfares, the ideologies. Even Pope Benedict, when he came here to the UK in 2010, even then he says he was concerned at how Christians as a whole are getting put more, or they're outside the public square because of their faith and
Mm.
where the world is. And I think that's even more the case now than it was then. But we've had warnings about how the apostasy will start at the top in the church. These compromises is a key word. The church will be filled with those who accept compromise as part of the Akita prophecy.
Yes.
And that's exactly what we're seeing now quite clearly. I'm always wary not to listen to the platforms and the person's own opinion, such as the letters that's just come out, not the encyclical, sorry, supplicans, fiducia supplicans, and other ones. It's like, well, make sure you're reading it and understanding it rather than looking for a third party opinion. Because sometimes I feel after watching one or two of those videos, I need to turn it off. It's negative still, and you have to. I think I'm always careful not to sit in opposition to the Pope. Who am I to judge? Who am I to critique his writings or anyone's writings as such? But when we have multiple apparitions of Our Lady spanning such a long time and more frequently towards the present day, when we see these things happening with such clear clarity, we know God, heaven, is not on this side of what the church is doing in many things right now. And again, cardinals against cardinals, bishops against bishops, part of Akita. And just tonight, I read that after yesterday, realizing the whole continent of African bishops have opposed this like couples blessings. They've opposed it completely, the whole continent of bishops in Africa. But now today, the German church are stopped funding the African church. And it reminded me years ago with America under Obama, they stopped certain countries in Africa from getting vital aid from a starving population until it changed its laws for gay rights, and they
Yeah,
chose to starve rather than give up what they believed in. And now the German bishops are doing it to their brother bishops in Africa.
it's terrible.
It's kinda I'm off on a tangent with that, but when I think of that cassock on the ground and the warnings we've had about the priesthood and other warnings Our Lady gave at Tre Fontane about the Pope, the riots, I'd like you to cover maybe as well about him fleeing Rome and things like that that Bruno covered in his visions. But, I think that's gonna come about. Something has to spark for that to happen. We might want to discuss if you wish. But this was back in 1937 she first appeared to the lady. 10 years later to the date, she appears to Bruno in 1947. Now everyone keeps going back to Vatican II. That was the blame of it all. But I remember coming across the School of Darkness with Bella Dodd, thanks to Father Chad Ripperger highlighting it in one of his talks.
Yeah.
Because way back in the 30s and the 40s, according to Bella Dodd, this is when the communists were infiltrating into the clergy. And I dare say from the 1930s, 40s, right up to the 1960s for Vatican II, some would have made ranked bishops or cardinals. So there has been a infiltration for sure. So even back then, Our Lady was letting us know, she was getting us prepared because we're starting to see all that come now. But I don't know where you want to pick up with that, what you think, am I right, or anything you want to add?
Oh, absolutely. So a lot of people point to Vatican II, and people have short memories, and they point to Vatican II because perhaps it was used as a vehicle to undermine the church. And actually, in these messages, it's the only apparition that I'm aware of that actually mentions Vatican II. And so we're going to talk about that message too. But the problem in the church, when I say the problem, I mean the ability of it to pass down the deposit of faith, it actually started incurring these problems before Vatican II. Not it just didn't happen overnight in the 60s when Vatican II occurred. And I like to think of it like I'm not sure how your audience would know this. It's a going to be an illusion, American illusion, but I look at Vatican II as similar to the church's Woodstock and the the big concert that happened in the 60s and 69. And the synod, I look at that as the children of Woodstock, the babies of Woodstock, they're getting together again to have Woodstock 2. And that's what I suspected.
Mhm.
So in both cases, the Vatican II and the synod, there was an attempt to use both of them to interject not just doctrine, but practices more than doctrine, practices that were counter to the teachings and traditions of the church. So I always looked at the synod as perhaps as a vehicle that's being established, and it had a predetermined outcome, and that's the reason why certain things were discussed and important things to the church that exist today that we all know of, and one which we mentioned of, which is a belief in the Eucharist, the real presence, that was not discussed, or at least not prominently. Why wasn't that like centrally discussed in the Synod? What's more important than discussing that? So that would raise a red flag to me right away when they weren't talking about matters like that. And also, there's other things that I could point to that are more important that they should be discussing. That's important for as Pope Benedict would say, the life of the Christian and the church. So, yeah, there definitely was a problem before Vatican II, and the infiltration occurred back then. And the infiltration was occurring by people who were enemies of the church. They weren't infiltration, it was not infiltration based upon a different thinking about theology or anything like that. These were enemies of the church that were entering into the church to undermine it.
Yeah.
Now, are there different, maybe heretical thinking too? Yeah, there is. And of course, the enemies of the church are going to assist, that type of thinking as well.
Mhm. Well, just on
So
that note, Bob, it's the two key phrases that stood out with me with Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich. And I don't keep referring back to her like she's biblical for me or anything, but it's just like that April 12th date, for example, stood out. And of course, we know about the Passion of Jesus from her writings, the House of Mary and John in Ephesus all came from her. She's one of the greatest mystics of the church, the entire history of the church. But she kept using those words around about those prophetic messages back in like the 1820s. She constantly saw the church being undermined. And the other key word that she was using a lot was compromises. Compromise in the church, further compromises. Undermining of the church, compromise. It was always key words.
yeah, and she actually had harsher words. She mentioned the anti-church and the dark church. And just for the sake of your audience, when we talk about the anti-church or the dark church, we're not talking about the Catholic Church. We're talking about those who perhaps call themselves Catholic, and maybe they don't call themselves Catholic, but they wish to create a different church. And you can see it in some of the proposals we just discussed, where they're looking to create a church that has no relationship to the traditions of the past or the deposit of the faith. In some cases, and I heard in one case, there was a bishop talking to Bishop Strickland and told him to stop talking about the deposit of the faith. Okay, well, that's what the church is all about, passing on the integrity of the deposit of the faith and saving souls. So if you're not talking about that, there's nothing to talk about. So it's I think it's we find ourselves today on the verge of schism, and in fact, there may be a schism that's already upon us.
Yeah. And it echoes Garabandal, something like a schism is going to
Yeah.
happen.
So you really have to be careful these days on what's being taught at your local parish. I mean, it's a real concern.
So, do you think this stuff's leading in a way? Because I think if the church has the high ground on like the moral side, we're now seeing that being undermined. We're seeing it being tarnished. It's been weakened through it trying to be more worldly. And that other recent letter that came out there for the New Year message from the Pope, how many times did they have to use the word diversity? He did it like the word was on speed. Diversity and inclusion. It
Yeah,
was so worldly, and again, I'm not there judging or critiquing him, but I've never been Mr. PC to a great extent. I've never embraced it fully because I see all the political correctness and everything else being communistic in ways to an extent. But this letter was something I haven't even seen coming from companies that I've worked for, or from the government, or for all the inclusion and diversity of multiculturalism. This letter was it's like you may as well left it in bold writing and you would have counted 20 times or something. It was constantly using these words of the world, and it came just within a week or two after the other letter, the supplicans one. But I just kind of find it's coming, it's snowballing almost out of control now. And I've got a sense inside a little bit that if the papacy, the Catholic Church, is going to be reduced to nothing else other than a moral compass for the entire world, more nothing more than just a conscience thing, then it's going to be so weakened that it'll easily just be tarnished and stood over. And I think that's what's going to happen to the point that the church going through its so-called mystical passion. I think when it gets so weakened, it's not going to be looked up to with esteem, even if it's at the back of the parade. I remember a priest saying that to me once. Everyone probably has it in the depth of them, knowing that the Catholic Church is the true church. It's just at the back of the parade. And I got what he meant with that. But now it's the case of like, well, there's nothing to see in high esteem, nothing to see inspiration from, even when I'm disagreeing with it. I still know it's the church. It's losing all that from these compromises, these false theologies and ideologies being undermined, these key words again. And I think sooner or later that's where it's going to be delivered to its enemies. And that's where I was wanting to pick up maybe with Bruno there in the page 75. How if you don't mind, if can I read this little bit? Are we okay to go here?
Go ahead, shoot.
It says Bruno had diverse experiences that can be considered somewhere between dreams and prophecies. In particular, on the night between the 31st of December 1984 and January 1st, 1985, he found himself at the Piazza Venezia in Rome. Bruno records that many people were gathered shouting, "Vengeance! Tremendous revenge!" There were many dead people in the piazza, in the adjacent piazzas, and in the streets. Suddenly the people started to cry out, "Everyone to St. Peter's." Now it goes on further all about it, how in the courtyard there was Pope, the cardinals, bishops, priests, and religious. Everyone was crying in astonishment. Uh, it goes on about how the church is one in many, and the fact that then comes on to how the Pope looked as if he had been shot and they were trying to flee. And then this was where just a mad mob took over St. Peter's. It goes on and on. First thing that stood out for me is the night between the 31st of December and January 1st, because that's when old Pope Benedict passed away in that day.
Yes.
Again, another papal figure. Nothing more about it other than that. But we've had the four popes of Garabandal concluded with Benedict on the 31st of December when his passing came. Francis is definitely that bridge. He is the one of the two popes alive at the time. As Anne Catherine Emmerich spoke about the time of two popes. I know there's another thing mentioned, but I think it's came around again for these times quite significantly. But this reminds me straight away of Fatima, that image of the city half in ruins. And I do believe more and more I've become convinced of watching good sources over the years. They haven't given everything about Fatima. And
No.
the only reason they would keep something secret still, I believe, knowing the church bureaucracy for 4 years in Rome and everything else in between, it's for preservation. That's probably the only reason. Something that contains a warning directly to the church. And I forget the cardinal who was one of the first to read the third secret of Fatima. I've got it on my Garabandal Fatima video. This cardinal who read it with the Pope John 23rd says, I
There's a
think,
there's a couple of them. There's Cardinal Chiappi and there's Cardinal Ottavani.
Chiappe, I think it was Chiappe. He says the apostasy begins at the top.
Yes.
And I think when this apostasy, this undermining and everything that they're doing in the wrong side, heaven's clearly warned them about for so long. This is not God's will. You're opposing God by doing this.
Mm.
The elect have been deceived, as it's stated in the Bible. This is where the enemies are going to come in to begin Calvary of the mystical body of the church itself. And I just don't know if Francis, in a way, might be this Pope that Bruno sees based on his fit and time of prophecy and everything that's coming round about him at once right now.
So a couple things there. One is what Cardinal Chiappi says, it's in line with many other Marian apparitions. So it's what was stated about Satan infiltrating the church at Akita, at La Salette, something similar at Garabandal, and I do believe that it was said at Fatima also. Now, with some of these prophecies, I take a spiritual view on them. I don't have a, I was going to say fundamentalist view, but it's not fundamentalist. I don't have a view where it's um, basically like black and white. There's some symbolism that's in these type of prophecies also. And I always looked at the prophecies regarding overtaking the church, with military. And I think Blessed Alana Yellow, she has a prophecy similar to that, where she says that, I'm going to paraphrase it, but I believe it is that Russia will, or communism, or communist flag will be raised upon the dome of St. Peter's. And there's something similar by Marie Julie Johanni regarding the overtaking of Rome via military force. So I look at that as more symbolic. And when you talk about like Russia or communism raising a flag above the dome,
Mm.
I look at that as the errors of Russia. And the errors of Russia are rampant all through Europe now. And in my opinion, with the Fiducia Supplicans, that in fact is a document which is a codification of the errors of Russia. And that in fact represents the raising of the flag above the dome of St. Peter's. And understand that the context of it is that the areas of Russia is not just the type of government. It's not about a communistic government necessarily. It's also the morality. There was a lot of immorality that was proposed by the communist governments in Russia. And being, that is what's rampant through Europe right now, the immorality. And you touched upon it briefly a few minutes ago when you said that the states, basically the nations, they're taking a position where they're almost counter the church, and they are. Many of their laws contradict the teachings of the church, and people who are faithful to the church have to live in societies that go counter to their beliefs.
Yeah. One
Anyway,
thing coming to mind as you speak there as well, because I was just looking at the book there, the key ones that are going to affect in the persecution of the church, Russia and Islam, and it really echoes a lot of Marie-Julie Jahenny. I know you're aware of Xavier being on the channel, and we've covered it quite a few times in depth. The timing right now, how, like, not to go again, I'm trying to connect the jigsaw piece here because Marie-Julie Jahenny spoke about this mass migration of as Muslims coming over. I know she called it, was it Mohammedans or something back then.
yes,
And we're seeing that. There's one thing that's been happening for the number of years now, biblical
they're
proportion.
already there.
Yeah, and there's no, we're not in a time of waiting. I don't believe we're in the time of it unraveling. That's what I believe now, because this has been at least a few years. It's always been on the news now and again, and it's biblical proportions of mass migration. And
Right. So with these prophecies, Mark, we have to be open to a couple things. One, mitigation. So there may be a prophecy because it does not transpire the way the prophecy was announced, doesn't mean that it was false. It could be that it's mitigated. Also, we have to look at the fact that there could be symbolic meaning to the prophecy itself. So you can't take it literally all the time.
no, definitely not. But when you're seeing it being echoed more than one source, but the big thing for me was how a long reigning English queen would pass. and the new
Yes.
sovereign of England would see the
Mm.
relationship between Britain, Israel, and Persia, modern-day Iran, break up, and look what's happening right
Yes.
now. In 24 hours of this recording, the UK and
Mm.
the US military are now doing the airstrikes in Yemen because of the Iranian-backed rebels. And Iran is just one step closer to Iran, which is a lot of prophecies on its own as well for where we are. And Russia's not relenting with Ukraine. It's all in the prophecies and the time that it's arrived at with Francis and the time of the English Queen passing there just over a year ago. You can't make this up. And again, the 50th anniversary of Akita just came days after October 7th with Hamas attacking Israel. Look how it's gradually got worse and worse from there, right through till now. And many people think that there's a possibility it fits the criteria where Garabandal, the warning and the miracle, could come as early as this April, which we're only about 90 days away or something until April 11th. That's another topic. But it
Yeah.
only takes one day for something to change, just like one day's change for Yemen.
Yes. Yeah.
So
I
we're
mean,
not where we're at, but I still want to know the idea of what could cause the spark for the civilians, like this civil unrest, these civil wars, this great persecution of the church at the same time. Because Russia ain't coming through with communists wanting to tear down our churches today. That was from back in Stalin's and time in the 1960s, but something's got to give in a way. I know we don't take the prophecies to the letter because, let's face it, for the last 40 plus years now, many of us at our own time of discovering Medjugorje are doing exactly what Our Lady's asking. We are praying every day. We are fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays. We are doing the first Saturdays. We are doing everything that's been asked of us in these apparitions. So please God, there's going to be a great impact of where things are mitigated for sure. But everything so far that I'm seeing is rolling out with crystal clear clarity to the letter of what was prophesied. And I just don't, I've got an idea how that spark could come amongst the populations. Uh, but what's going to cause the great persecution of the church? I know it's going to, I think it's a sense that it's going to be so undermined by itself, it's going to lose its moral stance, that's where it'll be easy to walk over and tarnish it, and things will build up from there somehow. I just don't know what that spark
yeah.
will be.
Well, unfortunately, it's already happening. So we don't need Russia to persecute the church. It's already being persecuted within the countries that it resides in. It's already being persecuted by the EU, which is the new form of Western communism that exists. I like to refer to it as the European Soviet Union. And they're actually imposing a lot of what I just mentioned, laws that contradict the faith. And it has to do with the kingship of Jesus. You don't see the kingship of Jesus being proclaimed anymore anywhere. We have a feast day, and you'll hear some lay people and priests say Jesus is king once in a while. But there's really, we really don't proclaim it. We don't abide by that thinking. And the nations are doing whatever they want. In some countries, the churches are being vandalized and they're being burnt down, and it's very frequent. The persecution is already occurring. And the persecution is not just the vandalization um, of churches, it's from within. I mean, we're seeing the persecution of good, holy people. Now, there's a lot of going back and forth, and um, regarding basically the contradiction between the bishops versus bishops, cardinals versus cardinals. But and I try to stay out of that, and I take a position that I'm not going to strike the Pope, but I am going to defend the faith. So that's my position that I'm taking, and I was glad to do some uplifting videos while everyone else was sniping about fiducia supplicans.
Yeah.
But we can't ignore it. We can't ignore the fact that this is happening, especially in light of Marian prophecies that we see. And I'll point to one other thing is in the United States is a great example where we had Father Pavone, who was known worldwide. He was laicized. We had Bishop Strickland very recently. He was removed from his office. And we had Cardinal Burke, who was also being very childishly persecuted by being threatened to remove his pension and to kick him out of his apartment or to make his staying at the apartment untenable by raising his rent fourfold, like 400%. So if you look at those three individuals, the commonality between the three is if you took a poll in the United States and you said, who's your favorite cardinal in the United States? Who's your favorite priest? Who's your favorite bishop? It would be those three. So that was done based upon nothing to do with the faith, them being unfaithful and not being Catholic. That was strictly ideological. And that is persecution from within the church occurring right there. And I have to point to if you're not listening to the church in the United States regarding who's the most popular bishop and cardinal and priest, what's the point of the synodality? So is synodality a real thing? Where's the listening church? They're not listening to the people, the members of the church in the United States. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing these things. Bishop Strickland is a beloved bishop in the United States. He was called America's bishop and still is. So um, I don't understand how people can just overlook that and try to deceive others to say that everything's okay or to find some pretext for doing what was done against these three members of the clergy.
No, for sure. After a wonderful 2 hours conversation in full with Bob, I've decided to split this video into two parts for the benefit of the viewers in order to use your own time to watch them. So please hit the thumbs up, subscribe and share, hit the bell notification for part 2, which will be coming later this week. Thank you.